I'm gonna vote no.
My goodness, that sounded so sad.
Good afternoon, everyone. This is the Vermont House Committee on Commerce and Economic Development. It is Tuesday, May 6, 2025 at 1:02 in the afternoon. And so we're here this afternoon for the first couple of hours to, I thought it's important that the committee actually get the mechanics of how the UI system works. If you're not an employer, you may not realize all the complexities of how the system works and the real need for us to protect the trust fund as much as we can. And I think with the possibility of a recession coming on, depending on how strong it is, if we get one, there are levers that can be pulled when we work together with the Department of Labor to ensure that the trust fund stays as healthy as possible. I've asked Commissioner Harrington to come in with bringing back Matt Bearowitz as well, so that we can have that conversation and better understand. Committee understands what all the schedules and all of those levers are. So, Commissioner, thanks for joining us this afternoon.
Happy to be here. Thank you for having me. For the record, Michael Harrington, Commissioner, Department of Labor. You may say, why do we need to know about all the intricacies of Vermont unemployment insurance? And what I would say is that this committee over the years, even prior to my time, has been instrumental in ensuring that we administer a fair and equitable and responsive system. And it really falls to the folks around this table to also ensure that not only is the department from a policy perspective implementing policies that support Vermonters and Vermont businesses, but again, from a protectionary standpoint, there is a fund of money that is used to pay benefits, and during downward economic times, that fund will go under a lot of strain. And it's up to this committee and the department to ensure the viability of that fund. And we can talk a little bit about what that means and what it means across the country and how other states also manage their funds. But at the end of the day, we want to be prepared. And I think we want everybody around this table to be prepared. Some have been doing this a long time and others maybe not so much. So our goal today is really just to read you in on how the system functions. I'm hoping at some point within the next half hour or so, our interim director of unemployment insurance, Christine Murphy, will be able to join remotely as well. For the record, she may be interim, but Christine probably has the most working knowledge of the UI system in the state. She's been with the department close to 20 years and has held everything from a customer service representative all the way up to a supervisor, an assistant director. She currently serves in an associate director role, but she's serving as interim director following the departure of Cameron Wood, who many of you may know, not only from his role as director, but now as a member of the legislative council team. So if all else fails, you can always go to Cameron and he can answer your questions. And then we've got Matt here too, and you may say, okay, why is the department's economist here? Matt does not only a lot of work looking through workforce and labor force data and occupational data, but he also has a role to play in the solvency of the trust fund. Part of his role is issuing annual determinations on a biannual basis. So every 6 months, there are annual determinations. And those determinations are calculations that are put in place either by statute or a rule or based on movement of the trust fund, but to ensure that we are managing our fund appropriately. So we can get into more details around that as well. But I think that the basics, and this is meant to be interactive. So if you have a question, just, throw your hand up or tell me to stop talking and we'll dig in. But as a general matter, unemployment insurance is to provide partial wage replacement for those who become unemployed due to no fault of their own. Right. So it's not meant to provide 100% wage replacement. There is a the carrot and stick attribute there that goes back, over 60 years now, over 50 plus years now, around the design and implementation of unemployment insurance across the country. It is a predominantly federally funded program. So we receive pre-pandemic, it was probably close to 95%. Now it's more like 70% of our money from the federal government. It is a federally required program. So every state needs to operate an unemployment insurance system, and that includes territories as well. So think of like Puerto Rico, the Virgin Islands, and so on, Guam. So again, each state administers an unemployment insurance system in accordance with both the federal requirements and the state requirements. So the feds may say that somebody needs to be able and available for work. The states get to determine really what does able and available mean, right? So again, looking at it both from a holistic perspective and then at a micro level, what does that mean for each individual state? The program is set up so that employers pay taxes into what is known as the UI Trust Fund, and the state pays benefits out of the trust fund. The key thing there is that the trust fund is funded through taxes that are paid by employers. So one misconception a lot of people have is that the employee pays the tax. It's not a payroll tax, right? So it doesn't come out of their paycheck. It comes from the employer directly. And the funds get housed at the U.S. Treasury, and we get to draw them down on a weekly basis to pay benefits. The one restriction over those funds is that they can only be used to pay benefits. So you could have $1 in your fund, you could have $1 billion in your fund, but at the end of the day, you can only use them to pay benefits. You cannot use them to administer programs or to fund other things, right? There are other states that are working, looking at and implementing, I don't want to call them workarounds, but other creative ways to help fund UI programs while still maintaining the viability of their trust fund. You'll hear Matt share and use a term called taxable wage base. And so an employer, if Representative Cooper was my employee, the taxable wage base currently, we had to look it up. What are we at? 14.8. So $14,800. So I pay a tax on the first $14,800 that Representative Cooper makes working for me in each calendar year, right? So typically when we talk about money going into the trust fund, our biggest quarter is our first quarter because it's, again, based on a calendar year. Most employees are working during that first quarter and paying, and the employer's paying contributions on those first $14,800 earned by the employee. And then obviously our second highest quarter is the second quarter, and then it falls off towards the fourth quarter. And so Matt can talk more about what does that number look like. The other thing is that a lot of employers want to know, like, how is my tax rate determined, right? So not every employer pays the same rate. So the way the statute is set up is that there are 5 what we call tax schedules. So tax schedule 1, it has the least amount of tax assigned to it. Tax schedule 5 has the most. And we move up and down those tax schedules based on the viability or solvency of the fund. And that's a calculation that Matt runs looking back over the last 10 years. A little caveat that some may not know is that if we had factored in the pandemic into that calculation over the past 5 years, we would be in tax schedule 5 and would have been there for a long time following the pandemic. But the legislature, and specifically this committee, worked during the pandemic to remove the calendar year 2020 and 21, just 2020. And so we removed 2020 from the calculation, and that, again, helped provide relief so that we weren't overburdening employers following this pandemic, and with the hope of, not putting anybody out of business because of the higher taxes they would pay. So if you look in the statute, there are 5 schedules. And again, we move up and down the schedules based on the calculation of the last 10 years. And within each one of those schedules, there's an array of tax rates. And I think it's something like 20 different rates within, 21. Thank you, Matt. And so there's 21 tax rates in each schedule, and employers are slotted into those 21 different rates based on how they perform against other employers. Right. So when we calculate somebody's tax rate, it's based on what is their overall payroll, what are their recent debits against their account, right? So how many people have filed for unemployment claims against their employer account, and what has that draw been on the trust fund? But then they are also compared to other employers in the fund. And so that's why I can't just look at an employer and say, if you take this number and multiply it by this number and subtract this number, you get your tax rate. Because at the end of the day, it's based on payroll, it's based on the claims made against the employer, but then it's also how does this employer compare to that employer within the rate schedule. And so we do rate scheduling once a year, and that's when we determine every employer's tax rate for the following year. And again, those contributions are paid directly into the fund. I'm going to pause there because that was a lot of information. I don't know if there are questions, or if Matt, you want to jump in and correct anything? Okay.
I got approval to ask a question. So, okay, so just so I understand, the tax is only applied to the first $14,800 that somebody earns. And I'm curious, what is the rationale for the taxable wage base, and how does that compare to how other states do it?
So Matt can talk about how it's calculated. The taxable wage base goes up and down based on a calculation that Matt's team uses annually. So we set, again, I think I mentioned in the beginning, there's a series of annual determinations that come out. And one of those annual determinations is every year Matt's team calculates the taxable wage base for employers. Pre-pandemic, it was just over 8,000, and it had been at $8,000 for a very long time. And then following the last recession, there were changes made so that the taxable wage base would increase and index up based on inflation and other numbers. And then there are other provisions where it might go up $2,000 or down $2,000, depending on tax schedules and moving in and out of tax schedules. I would have to pull up our comparison with other states. We didn't look up the comparison necessarily currently, but it is the number one way that states can control how much or how few dollars are going into their fund. There are, and I'm not going to remember them, but there are two tax type systems that states utilize, benefit ratio states. And do you remember the other one?
Array states?
Yeah, I don't know. I'll have to look it up. Cameron wouldn't. Cameron was here. And so again, it's a methodology. So there are two different methodologies that states have deployed across the United States on how to tax and fund their trust funds.
You remember when Matt was here last week or the week before, we talked about what got us into trouble in the first place during the recession was the taxable wage base was stagnant at 8,000, but our maximum weekly benefit kept going up. So we're pulling, and during times of good times, we should be filling the coffers up, and we were actually losing money in the trust fund during good times. So you can imagine what happened when the recession hit, and then we got into big trouble. So,
and I think part of what we want to talk about here is we don't want history to repeat itself, but we are kind of at that point where, and I know the chair knows this, where we need to start having those conversations because we have a scenario where tax rates are low, but benefit payments are high. And that's not because of the number of people filing, it's because the benefit amount per person has continually climbed year over year.
that we're losing, I think our wage overall wage in the state has been going down because we have fewer people that are working.
Yeah.
And so there's a lot of different scenario things that are going on in there that are causing us to just think about where we are. Emily?
I have a different question. Is the fund itself tied to the market in any way?
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Matthew Bearwitz. I'm an economist for the Vermont Department of Labor. I am the director of the Economic and Labor Market Information Division. Thank you for having me. The fund is more akin to like a money market account. So it is an interest-bearing account, but it is not tied to the market. It is more akin to like federally backed bonds, like kind of akin to that a payout or return. So I think last I saw was like 3% and change. So on our fund of $300 million last year, we made $10 million in interest.
If you want to talk about that a little bit.
The fund amount.
Well, yeah, but I mean, the interest that we're gaining is
Yes.
kind of helping balance things out.
Yeah, and so that's one of the other indicators we're beginning to look at as well is what is coming out of the fund on an annual basis, what is going into the fund on an annual basis. So Matt's got some information that I think we shared with the committee. But we're roughly even, and I use the term roughly, in terms of debits and credits, but really what's helping the fund move forward at this point is the interest that we're earning on the fund. So if interest rates fall, we'll be earning less money. And the same thing is that, if there is a downturn, and we start drawing more out of the fund, that interest will not obviously accumulate as quickly. Conversely, pre-pandemic, we were over 500 million in the fund. And so we were earning a lot of interest at that point. And so the fund was not just solvent, but very healthy. And some of that, there were talks at that time about if the fund is so high and the interest is accumulating so fast or in such large amounts, how do we provide relief to employers, right? Like in a place where you've got a very solvent, healthy fund and interest is accruing at a certain rate, can you provide relief to employers at that point? So there are a lot of different mechanisms there.
I was here for the 20, and so I got the crash course in this, and there's still pieces I don't understand. And one of the things you mentioned was the 21 levels of, and so, for example, those businesses like the road construction business that annually lay people off and their workers get unemployment insurance, I believe. Would that put them at a higher rate, therefore, because they're laying off large numbers and it's predictable, but they're also big companies, so that they're going to fall into that?
Yeah. So, and there are challenges. The way we calculate and rate employers is a very imperfect system. And so there's that example, and then there's the converse of that. So like in Representative White's example, you might have an employer like a large construction firm that regularly lays employers off seasonally. And so because of the amount of claims against their account on a regular basis, we are actually paying more out of the fund than they are contributing, even though they are at the higher end of the tax rate. So in many cases, large construction firms are literally at the highest rate possible. And so from that perspective, it doesn't matter to them whether they, from an interest rate perspective, it doesn't matter to them, or a tax rate perspective, it doesn't matter to them whether they lay off one more person or 10 more people because they are at the highest rate possible. But what we often see in the fund too is that it's a socialized system, right? So the rest of the employers across the entire system are what help to balance the fund, even in situations where you might have an employer that is paying less in taxes than we are paying out in benefits against their account. On the flip side of that too, this imperfect system can at times create a lot of hardship for small businesses. So you might be a small employer with, 5 employees, and not lay somebody off for 20 years. And then you have this situation where you need to lay off an employee. And so your payroll has remained pretty constant throughout that time, and you've been having 0 claims against your account or 0 draws against your account, and then you have this one spike, and that could also move you up in a tax rate to a point where you're paying what feels like an exorbitant amount of taxes for a 3-year period. And so that it can also hurt on the other side too.
Lee, did you have a question? You had your hand up before. Huh? Okay. Hi.
So right now, little snapshot of right now, what is the lowest possible rate? And what is the highest possible rate of those 21 levels?
Rate class 0 is currently 0.4%. And it goes all the way up to 5.4%.
And is that Schedule 1?
That is Schedule 1.
Yeah, so in the schedule we are in,
And then it can keep going.
Yeah.
yeah,
So
And I have one other clarifying question, just so I understand this right. So, let's say I make $15,000 and Chair Markup makes $115,000, just in my scenario.
Thank you.
Both pay the same amount, our employer pays the same amount
Same
into the
percentage.
fund, same percentage of the 14,800.
Well, depending on where you're at.
Yeah, but let's say we work for the same employer.
Okay.
He's my boss.
Yeah.
And it's a 1%, and it's
The other way
1%.
around.
So it's 1% of 14,800 for both of us. But then let's say, okay, you've got a boss, because that boss lays us both off. But then he would get the maximum benefit and I would just get a benefit based on my $15,000, even though our employer paid the same amount for both. Okay. That's how I thought I understood it.
so one piece in there is that when we determine eligibility, I didn't get into benefits yet, but you hinted at the fact that there are one, we have to determine whether the separation from employment makes the person eligible. And then 2, are they monetarily eligible? Have they earned enough, right, to become eligible? Have they earned enough and the employer paid enough in taxes on their wages to make them eligible? And then we calculate what their benefit amount would be, right? So depending on how much you've earned, you can have anywhere from the low to the max.
So just following up, so I think where Abby was headed. So the only variable is the amount of claims or the claims history for the employer in terms of those 21 different rate categories
And payroll.
and payroll.
So it's, so if you are, so where we see this, right, imagine, again, it's unemployment insurance, right? And we don't often think about it as insurance, but if it were car insurance and you had a fleet of 5 vehicles and then you grew your fleet to 25 vehicles, right, you'd be paying more on those, right? So if you have 5 employees and then over the course of a year, you hire 10 more employees, right? You've now tripled your workforce. So the payroll, so it's based on payroll, annual payroll, and claims.
But the tax, whatever that tax is only going to be applied to the 14.8, right?
Correct.
Do any other states do it any other differently?
Yes.
Yeah, in terms of.
No,
You know,
in this calculation, in this methodology, it's the same.
Okay.
And, just by way of reference, you get kind of a visual of this in section 1326 of Title 21. So you can see, they call them rate classes. And so it covers 2 pages here, but they have rate classes, and then it starts showing you the different rates within those classes.
My question relates to the use of payroll in this determination. Obviously, the more employees you have, as you just spoke about with Herb, the greater the risk you have. But is it also because, say, you're in a higher end type work where you pay higher salary, therefore your risk if you have a mass layoff for some reason? Is that the other part of it, or is it simply the number of employees that drives the payroll consideration?
Think about it in terms of like a numerator and a denominator. So the numerator is going to be how much benefits have been charged to the actual cash dollars. So if you laid off a bunch of people who are making maybe or who are earning less money or working part-time, that would not be as much benefits to your numerator as if you laid off a bunch of people who are getting the maximum. The denominator being that taxable payroll. So if you had a big company, regardless of like the number of employees, either there was like a lot of people making an average amount or a few people making a lot of amount, it would be in that bottom right there. So you can see it. So that's why the commissioner pointed out for smaller employers, sometimes a layoff can feel more harmful because that you went from a 0 experience rating where you had no benefits charged to you, and then you have a low denominator because you're a small company. That's going to give you a big ratio compared to a large company. If you laid off 10 people, but you have a staff of 1,000, you have a big denominator, and it kind of, can, make that a smaller calculation for the large employer. So they might not be as susceptible to movement.
And this may be something that can address in the course of the comments, if it's not like a head-on question right at this moment. I'm curious how the system is able to account for people with multiple jobs and being out of one but not the other at the same time, and then other seasonal things. Is it just knowing that that's the reality for so many ranchers and farm workers, et cetera? So wherever that comes in, I'm happy to hear.
Sure. The farm workers is a separate conversation because a lot of our work at the Unemployment Insurance Division at the Vermont Department of Labor is UI or agricultural workers are carved out in terms of eligibility. But as it relates to multiple job holders, it is based on an individual relationship between an employee and employer. And so that taxable wage base is at 0 every time that starts. So if you had 3 different jobs over the course of the year, that employer is going to pay taxes on the first $14,800 that you earn in each one of those positions.
And if you're out of one, but you have your other 2, you might still qualify for benefits from the one.
Partial. Yep.
Yeah. Okay.
Yep. You could qualify for partial benefits, which would take into consideration your continued earning as well as the lack or the loss.
Just 50% earnings disregard.
And so we look at, like when somebody qualifies for benefits, we'll look at all of their wages earned. And then I think the place where this becomes a factor too is there is proportional charging back to the employer based on the number of wages in the base period. And so when we calculate somebody's benefit amount, we kind of look back over 18 months. And so let's say you worked 17 of those months for one employer, you quit and you went and worked for another employer, and then you got laid off at that employer. The way we would look at that, there are different scenarios that either relieve an employer charges or not. And so again, it's where did the base wage, the wages in the base period come from, which employer? So what's that?
Yeah.
Of course, huge.
Yeah.
There's mud.
So the other side of this, which we've started talking a little bit about, are the benefit side too. And in the benefit side, which is probably the one you hear about the most, right? Because you're probably dealing with constituents at the individual level. Again, this is where the complexities of a federally funded and federally required program make it extremely difficult sometimes to meet the needs of Vermonters, because there is a heavy series of eligibility criteria that have to be met in order for somebody to qualify. And so I know many times we, and I'm including all of us in this, we look at somebody's unemployment based on and the urgency at which they need funding, right? I'm going to lose my house. I can't put food on the table. And our heart tells us that they should be eligible and we need to pay them right away. And unfortunately, we've got a program that is built around a number of eligibility criteria that are federally mandated in most cases, that may preclude that person, no matter how dire their circumstance is, from receiving benefits. For example, if they voluntarily quit their job versus if they were laid off. One makes them eligible for unemployment. So if they are laid off from work because of a lack of work, they are eligible. If they quit their job, they are not eligible. If they lose their job due to misconduct of any kind, depending on whether it's simple misconduct or gross misconduct, that will determine whether or not they are eligible after a period of time or ineligible for the eternity of that claim. So again, there are a lot of different factors that play into this. But what happens is when somebody becomes displaced from their employment, they can file a claim, and everybody has the ability to file a claim, right? So we don't preclude anybody from filing a claim. It's just whether or not we deem it eligible or not. And so in this case, to give you a little bit of history, prior to the pandemic, Vermont used to only accept claims over the phone and in terms of opening a claim. So you have to open a claim, and we call those initial claims. And then every week you have to file or certify for each week of benefits you want to receive. So for each week you are unemployed, you have to file a weekly benefit or a weekly claim. We call those continued claims. And so when somebody comes through the door, they call us, we help file their initial claim in our system. And during the pandemic, we moved that system online and we saw fraud skyrocket. And so we're seeing that not only the number of claims coming through the door was extremely high, but the percentage of those that were fraudulent were extremely high. So 90%, we would, at any given time, we probably take like maybe 50 to 80 claims a day, right? And at one point we were seeing 2,500 claims a day. And of those 2,500 claims, 90% of them were fraudulent. And so we got through the bulk of the pandemic. And as we were coming down the backside of the pandemic, we actually went back to taking claims over the phone. And we saw that the number of claims dropped, and we went from 90% fraud to 10% fraud. And so, one thing we learned is that fraudsters don't like to talk to actual people. And so in some ways, we were protected as a small state because of our low tech. We've actually been protected at a cybersecurity level simply because of the age of our system in a variety of different ways. So, there are silver linings to all the challenges we have had. And so, part of the other problem we ran into during the pandemic is that when we would take a claim over the phone, there was an automated system that we had put in place that allowed our people opening initial claims to roughly take about 12 minutes to open a claim. That system no longer works and works with the mainframe we have. And so it takes roughly 25 minutes to file a claim now. And so again, because of the manual entry of information and the fact that it's being entered directly into the system. So again, what we're trying to do is, the new system will help a lot of that. But when we talk about, issues at our call center, it's because so many automated processes became manual. And so people are on the phone a lot longer, not just waiting, but when they get to an agent, they're talking with the agent for a longer period of time. So it cuts down the number of calls that we can get through in a given day. But somebody files a claim, you'll hear this term a lot. It's not a happy term for a lot of people, but we have what's called adjudications, or another simple way to think about it is additional fact finding. The the term adjudications became a dirty word during the pandemic, because it was felt like we were, maybe unfairly moving claims into adjudications, which means that we have to have a fact finder conduct interviews on those claims. But it really, at the most simple term, means that we just need more information before we can determine eligibility, right? So there may be something that was said on somebody's application that now causes us to say, okay, because you said that you received some type of severance, or maybe you got paid out some accrued leave, we now need to do the additional fact finding to determine how much accrued leave you got paid out and whether or not the employer, because it is a dual due process system, right? So the claimant has due process rights in the system, but so does the employer, right? So in all fairness to both sides, right, we have to confer and confirm information between both the claimant and the employer. Both have appeal rights, both have rights to challenge decisions. And so there is a level of fact finding that has to happen. Roughly, I would say 30%, maybe as high as 50 during the pandemic, but at this point, it's around 30% of all claims go through fact finding, additional fact finding. Our goal with the new system is that much of that fact finding can be done by the system. But a lot of it right now is, we have the employer, we have the claimant fills out the initial application with the call taker. And based on the information, we say, okay, they have a couple different issues on their account. They have offsetting remuneration. They have able and available. Maybe they say, hey, I'm actually injured and I can't work, or I'm on vacation for the next 30 days and I'm not available to work. So one of the core tenets of somebody collecting benefits is they have to be able and available to work, right? So are they able to work, physically able to work, and are they available to work? So if somebody offered them a job tomorrow, could they show up at work the next day? And so if somebody says, hey, I'm unemployed and I'm going to go, this is my time to go take my vacation with my family for the next 30 days, that person would likely not be eligible during the family vacation. Or if they said, I have back problems that prevent me from doing this work, and so I had to leave my job, or some other factor. There are other programs that may support that individual in state government, but unemployment insurance may not be it. And that is because they're not able to return to work. So that is one of the core issues we run into that require some additional fact finding. Under the federal law, every state is supposed to have their time lapse on adjudications or fact finding under 21 days. I don't know many states that are able to do that right now since the pandemic. We've been as high as 120 days. Some states were over a year on timeliness because of the claims that came through. We're back now under 45 days. And so that, again, is the time it takes for the claim to move through the adjudications process.
Is that then without any kind of
Benefit? Yeah.
being paid, or is
Yeah,
there
so
interim?
if no, there is no
Okay.
interim payment. And part of that is because we're still trying to determine through the fact finding process if they're eligible.
Right.
Right. So if you provide payment to them and you deem them ineligible after that, you have to claw it back. And so again, those are scenarios where, and legally, we're not able to pay benefits until we determine eligibility. And that is a federal requirement.
A question on something you talked about earlier. The initial claim,
Mhm.
if you are in the construction business and you get laid off every year, do you go through that same initial claim process each and every year, or is that expedited in some way?
No, it's every year, but it's every year because it's on a yearly basis. So when you open a claim, your claim stays open for a year. Unless you have intervening employment, you go back and you have a different separation from employment. But if you open a claim, it stays open for the entire year. And then we have add and reopen claims. So if there's a a cooling, a period where someone may have gone back to work and needs to reopen a claim. There are different processes for doing that. So every year when somebody is seasonal, they have to reopen. And that's also because a lot of the information that's collected on the initial claim changes. And so part of that is ensuring we have all the most up-to-date information.
Just curiosity question.
Yeah.
Do you have any, how do you audit? Like, I know a lot of people that do unemployment claims
Mhm.
and, you have to certify that you're looking for work, that you're actively applying for
Yep.
jobs. How do you audit that?
Yeah. So it's become easier or harder, depending on how you want to look at it, with the advancement of, a lot of job searching happens online now, right? And so part of that is also needing to rethink the way we think about people who are looking for work and because, back in the day it was, do you have 3 job contacts, right? And so what is a contact? And in some cases, it was walking to the employer and walking in and saying, hey, do you have a job available? And if they say no, you got them to sign your piece of paper, and that was your one job contact. So while somebody is unemployed, they have to look for work. In most cases, they have to do 3 job contacts a week, and then they have to report those to us. Over the course of the years, we typically will audit those. So we will do just spot audits and call the employer and ask if this person applied for a job. Again, that was something that didn't happen during and immediately following the pandemic, just for lack of resources. We didn't have the people to do the work. And again, at the end of the day, if the question is, how do we move adjudications through to get people their benefits faster versus using those people to call employers to verify work search, we're going to focus on getting benefits out the door faster. We've now gotten back into a process where we are doing some of that auditing and reviewing of work search, and that'll be an ongoing process. We also there are different functions that happen in the unemployment insurance program. And so we have a variety of different program integrity functions that occur, both where we're looking at claims to ensure eligibility was determined correctly, that we calculated their benefit rate correctly, and we're doing those audits and then providing that information, reporting back to the federal government, who is monitoring our effectiveness of managing and administering the program. And so on the job search piece, there are other creative ways that, other states, and we've thought about this too. We don't have the systems in place yet to do it, but, some states will say you have to do 5 work searches a week, but 2 of those can be attending a workforce development activity, right? So meeting with a workforce counselor or going to a job fair. And so you just have to have a system that is capable of tracking those other items as well. And so we've looked at that as well as part of our modernizing of both our UI system and our workforce development system. The statute actually says individual claimants are required to look for work as instructed by the commissioner. And so there's a lot of leeway there in terms of what the commissioner can set in terms of the number of job contacts or what other activities they could do that we would, if we said, hey, we want you to meet with a job counselor, right? And if you do that, that would count as one of your job functions. It serves a dual purpose. One, it helps them meet their requirements for the program. 2, our workforce development system is funded by the number of contacts and enrollments we have in our programs. And so, those are the types of things where we could be helping each other out. So moving through the benefit process. So individuals, we determine eligibility, we calculate their weekly benefit amount. I think Matt could tell you what the average is. I think it's probably around 350, 400 now.
The average
weekly benefit amount.
average is like 600 now.
Oh, is it now? So that's another indication of kind of the world we're in, because at one point it was roughly half or 2/3. And now our maximum weekly benefit amount is upwards of 700. It depends on whether you count that $60 rider or not. But if, I think we were just looking today, it's like 668 or something along those lines. And so if the average is over 400 now, that's also an indication of wages, right? So as wages increase across the system, people are eligible for more benefits at the time of separation. Anything else you want to share on wages versus benefits, or what that might be an indication at a higher average?
No, I guess I could speak to the since the pandemic, we saw prices across the board in the stores for services rise. Wages are typically a little slower to react. And so now that inflation or price pressures on other goods and services has kind of come down, we're seeing wages are still up. And so we were just discussing in Senate Economic Development, looking at the quintiles of how wages are paid. And we're seeing actually the lower wage positions have seen the greatest growth in the last year or two. So getting somewhere in the order of 5, 6, almost 7% year-over-year wage increase for the 10th and 25th percentile. So again, indicative wages can be slower to react than prices, but I think a lot of workers know that, and employers know there's been a change in the cost of labor.
And I think when we talk about wage replacement, it's around 57%. And there's a reason why it's not 1-to-1, because we want people engaged in the workforce. We don't want them out too long. And so by someone not getting, they're used to their paycheck, we want them to continue to be used to getting that paycheck. And so by keeping the benefits down, incents people to go out and look for that new job, unless they're waiting, they've been laid off for a few weeks and they know they're coming back.
Yeah, the ultimate goal is to ensure that they can, pay rent, pay their mortgage, put food on the table. There are, and there are many other, obviously, Vermont has many different supports out there for individuals, but it's not supposed to be total wage replacement. Other things I like to ask Matt on a whim, and sometimes he has the answer, but what you have to earn in a year in order to make the max has gone up over the past years too. And so I think it's a little over $60,000 now. I think when I first started, it was in the 40s. Mm-hmm. So if you're making $60,000 or more at this point, you're at the max of the weekly benefit.
Does that include total compensation? I mean, if you're getting overtime and, other things like that?
Total wages, right? So it's, yeah. So it has to be wages earned. It can't be mileage, non-monetary. Yeah, exactly. The other piece we get into, people have to look for work. They have to accept work when offered. And it has to be, in some ways, they can be a little selective in terms of, is it similar work? So again, they do have some discretion there about where they look for work, how they look for work. They don't have to take just any job or they don't have to just apply to any job. They can be a little selective in which jobs they apply to. And again, they can earn up to the maximum weekly benefit amount, which with the $60 is $729 a week. The highest state right now is Massachusetts. Their maximum weekly benefit amount is $1,051 a week. Again, a lot of that I think is driven by various metropolitan areas as well. And then you can be eligible for up to roughly 26 weeks of benefits, so about 6 months. So when we talk about what is the impact on people, worst case scenario for the employer or best case scenario for the claimant, I think it ends up equaling about $18,000 something if you take the maximum weekly benefit amount and you times it by 26 weeks. And so again, partial wage replacement to help float people until they can find the next job. Obviously, the one of the biggest factors in that is what is the economy around those individuals doing, right? So right now, it's still a job seekers market out there, but as the economy slows, the number of people unemployed increases, the number of jobs available decreases, and we get the inverse of those, and then there aren't those jobs available. In situations where there are economic downturns and recessions, there are other mechanisms that the federal government will deploy in order to extend benefits for people. So we have the extended benefits program. And so that in many cases, those funds can sometimes be covered by the federal government, but they authorize a longer period of collection for individuals if, again, the harder it becomes to find work. Yeah.
So I think I remember you said that the eligibility and continued eligibility requirements are not in federal law, as opposed to the benefit amounts, which the states can play around.
Yeah, yeah.
The eligibility, that's fixed in federal law.
Some of it. So in, the way it's always been explained to me is the feds tell you what you have to do, the states can determine how. And so there are levels of eligibility that are driven by the federal government, and then there are levels of eligibility that the state has some discretion over. But in terms of ensuring that there are roughly, I think, 7 or 8 qualifying factors that people have to answer in the correct manner in terms of being eligible for benefits. There's also, so the other, once a case goes through the adjudications process, they're issued a determination by an adjudicator, and that determination can be a whole host of things in terms of if they're eligible, not eligible, partially eligible. It really depends on the factors. But in any case, the employer and the claimant both have appeal rights. And so there are multiple levels of appeal. So lower level appeals happen by administrative law judges, which are employees of the Department of Labor. They are fact-based. They collect evidence. They take sworn testimony. So a lot of, one of the things I run into in my position, right, is a claimant or somebody who wants me to intervene on behalf of the claimant. And there are times when it's acceptable to do that. One of the times when it's not acceptable is once it's gone into the appeal process, because it is quasi-judicial in nature. And also because you don't want to be having ex parte communications. When somebody goes through the lower level appeal process, the second level of appeal is actually to the Employment Security Board. That's a 3-member board. It includes the Commissioner of Labor or their designee, and they're appointed by the governor. It includes a member of different political parties. And so, again, traditionally it's been Democrat and Republican or some variation thereof. And they meet weekly. They hear roughly 5 to 10 cases a week. And then beyond that, if either party wants to further that appeal process, they can appeal to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court will weigh in as a final level of appeal as to whether or not, and it could be anything from, the reason somebody was separated and whether they should be eligible, to whether or not they were found to have defrauded the system and need to pay back benefits, or whether they were taxed appropriately or paid their taxes or didn't. And so there are a lot of different reasons something can go through the appeal process. There are 2 types of employers. And so, which you may be familiar with because there was some legislation that came out recently, but there are taxable employers and contributory employers, so or reimbursable employers. And so reimbursable or typically tax exempt entities, so nonprofits and municipalities of different sorts, or governmental agencies. So a taxable employer is what we talked about in terms of, the employer receives a tax rate and they pay that tax rate on the dollars earned by each employee. A reimbursable employer is an employer, again, nonprofit, municipal, governmental, where they aren't assessed a tax rate. So they do not pay into the fund on a quarterly basis. But when there is a claim against them, they have to reimburse the fund dollar for dollar. And so if they employ somebody and they lay somebody off and that person collects $18,000 worth of benefits, they are then required to repay the fund $18,000. And so you can be determined to be a taxable employer, but you can't choose to be a reimbursable employer, but you can be a reimbursable employer and choose to be a taxable employer, right? So if you are a commercial business, if you're deemed a taxable employer, you are a taxable employer. But if you are a reimbursable employer, you do have the ability to petition the department to have your status changed. And it's the benefit or the advantage or disadvantage is really up to the discretion of the employer in that case. In some cases, if they are a small nonprofit and they don't lay off individuals on a regular basis, it may be more beneficial to not have to pay and save some of that money and then use that money when and if the time comes when you lay somebody off. If you're a larger nonprofit, it may be easier financially for you to be able to pay an annual tax rate. That's just scratching the surface of the system. So, and we're about halfway through our time. So I do want to let Matt go through some of his items, if that's okay. And we can continue to ask and answer questions as they come up. Is there anything specific you also wanted me to cover?
No, but there's also another branch out of the taxable employers, and I think we touched on it, is the negative balance employer. And so I think we'll talk about that as well.
Yeah.
Ramifications that we're seeing now for the trust fund. But I'll let you continue on.
Well, and just to provide scope on that. So when we talk about negative balance employers, there's actually different levels. So there's single, double, triple. I don't know if we're up to quadruple, but our biggest challenge are what we call triple negative balance employers, and that's again where the claims coming out of that charged against that employer are 3 times the amount or more than what they are contributing to the fund. And that's not to say it's right or wrong, like that's the way the system is designed, right? Because if they had to pay dollar for dollar, it might bankrupt them. And we are in a unique situation as a state that relies heavily on seasonal work, that there are some concessions made in those circumstances where, one of the biggest challenges, especially in this current market that employers have when we look at seasonality is, if you're a construction company, right, and you have to lay off your entire staff come November, but you need to be able to hire them back at a moment's notice come March, right? If all of those people go out and get other full-time jobs and aren't coming back, you have to go through this entire hiring process in order to bring people back to be able to start the construction jobs and meet the needs of the market. And so again, some of this was around protecting both the business, protecting the employee, protecting the industry. Again, so that's not to debate whether they're right or wrong. It's just these are things that contribute or create different circumstances that we have to navigate, both as a department and a legislature when talking about UI.
And as a business.
I'm sure this question is way more simple, than the answer is. But because it's a federal program, but it's run by the state, can you, as you get to these points, talk to the points that this is something we can't change. This is something that we have some flexibility around. I think that's gonna be helpful.
Yeah, and I got asked actually at an event 2 weeks ago, can't we just do away with the UI program and create our own state program? Right? And why couldn't we create our own fund and tax our own employers and create the same situation without all the oversight and federal bureaucracy that comes with it? There are benefits. So again, in this case, we receive a significant amount of funding to operate the program, right? And so while we could probably do it for less, it would still cost the state more to operate the program than it does right now. So for example, it takes roughly $10 to $12 million to run the program. We receive about $7 million from the federal government, and then the rest comes either through the general fund or some penalty and interest money that we collect over the course of a year. So again, there is still a significant amount of funding that comes from the federal government. There's also benefit to the employer. And so there is a federal tax rate. And you may see that if you're an employer, we have SUTA and FUTA, right? So one is state UI and one is federal UI. But there is a FUTA tax credit that every employer receives. It's a little over 5%. And so that tax credit would go away if we stopped operating a program. And so it would put more strain on the employers as well. But I will turn it over to Matt because I know he's got a series of documents that were submitted to the committee. And this will talk a little, we can talk about the mechanics of the program, but this talks a little bit more about how we look at the trust fund and the various annual determinations that we make.
I just got a question.
Just,
Yeah, go ahead.
You said 5% of what? You were saying.
It's a payroll credit. So I'd have to look at
Okay,
how
so,
it's factored and how it's calculated. And Chair Marcotte may have a better answer just as an employer about how the FUTA gets applied or where the benefit to the employer comes in.
so the federal monies are funded from the FUTA, right?
Yeah.
And the state is funded from the state.
Yeah. Yeah.
And together they comprise all the monies? Are there any outside subsidies to the federal trust?
No, so again, so I would separate administrative dollars from trust fund dollars, right? So administrative dollars come 70% from the feds, 30% from the state government. So that's either general fund or some penalty and interest money that is collected by the department. And then the taxes collected by the employer on behalf of the state go into the trust fund. Right. So there are no tax dollars collected from employers that fund the administration of the program.
But all the money that funds claims
Comes from
either the federal UI tax and
no, just from employers. So all benefits dollars come from employers.
based on the tax they pay.
Yeah. So any, again, I think it's a payroll tax credit, the FUTA tax credit, and we can look at how it's applied. I just don't know off the top of my head.
Thank you.
So from where we left off on our last conversation, we kind of gave a quick overview of where the trust fund was. And there was 2 questions that were left hanging in terms of this committee requested additional information. And so one of the ways to address those was to share some reports that we produce at the department that help us kind of track this thing and study this thing. The first being we do a 20-year statistical record of Vermont unemployment insurance program. And so what this is all the complexities of the program kind of summarized in many tables and graphs about how the numbers, like where the rubber meets the road, basically. And so one of the questions asked during last committee was the taxable wage base and kind of showing what the taxable wage base was over time. So table 1 in this publication actually does show taxable wage base starting 2004 all the way back. And so as the chair mentioned earlier, that we used to have a taxable wage base that was frozen at 8,000, and it had been frozen like that for a long time. And it was once the Great Recession starting in late 2007 took hold where we really started the free fall. Even though the fund was declining for a while, that's where the fund ended up going negative. And so this was legislative action to, by statute, say, okay, we were at 8,000, now we're going to go to 10,000, now we're going to go to 13,000, now we're going to go to 16,000. And once we're at 16,000, we're going to keep it there until until we get to a certain schedule. Like, so, we have two things at play here. How the tax rate schedule is set every July based on how much is in the trust fund. And then there's the taxable wage base. So I think Representative Duke, you asked a question earlier about like, what are the other taxable wage bases in other states, and not to throw another as complicated topic on the table, but think about household homestead tax rates. You can have your CLA, your common level of appraisal, right? So there's other states that have a taxable wage base of $30,000. But their tax rates are very different, right? So it's like, how do you, though, between those two pieces, and so it's always very difficult to compare apples to apples when you're looking across states, because you really have to dive in, and then you have to assess the common experience rating of that employer based on the system in play. So the taxable wage base is just one metric of how our taxes get set in Vermont, the other being the tax rate schedule. So when we were talking about taxable wage base, you can see that it has grown over time. And when we talk about FUTA, the federal unemployment tax assessment, they have a frozen level, I believe, at $7,000. So for the first $7,000, you're taxed at this federal tax rate. And because Vermont's in this, it's a kind of a little backwards way of thinking about it. The tax rate is actually up here, but because Vermont is in an accepted program, you get a FUTA tax credit reduction, or FUTA tax credit, and it moves it down. So because we're in this program. And the reason there's another level of complexity is back when we were borrowing money, because we were borrowing money, the federal government says your system is out of compliance with what we'd like to see, for simplified terms. We're going to do a FUTA tax credit reduction. So full tax here, you're down here because you're borrowing money. We're actually going to move you back up. And every year that you're out of compliance, we're going to move it up and up and up and up until we find out that you're back in compliance with where we want you to be, kind of thing. So this FUTA tax credit ultimately is really important to employers, because it's not really, it's like having a sticker price and really what you pay. So there is a sticker price, but it's really what you pay unless we're out of compliance, and then it starts going back up because we have a FUTA tax credit reduction. That's easy enough to follow. So that was one of the things, and maybe just taking a pause there on the taxable wage base, because this is one of the significant mechanisms, to Representative Granning's point, this is one of the significant mechanisms where there is ability to influence. It was legislatively said, we are going to set it this year at $10,000. Next year, we're going to do $13,000. And the year after that, we're going to do $16,000. And then after that, we're going to inflate it based on a metric. And then that metric is in place currently. And so you'll see those adjustments as it grows and shrinks. So taxable wage base being a key part, reset. We do the annual determination in October, November area so that we can announce it to employers come January 1st, new clock starts. Okay, great. As we dive in, or people are curious about how the health of the trust fund is performing, I really encourage you can look at this document. There's many pages and graphs, including, what is the rate of benefits, covered wages to benefit payouts. So you can see the ratio of what's growing faster and what's not. I think at this point, just for the interest of time and what the committee asked for previously, I would switch to the experience rating table, summary 2023. This kind of gives you a visual outlay of just the current state of the array, right? So as we've discussed, there's actually 5 tax rate schedules. And when we get set in one, this happens in July, we get put in tax rate schedule 1. That's where we currently are. Then we can look at, on this calendar year basis, July 1 to July of the prior year, and we can see how the array is distributed across these 21 rate classes. And so within that document provided, table 1 just kind of shows the detailed how many employers are in each rate class.
You need access.
Do you want me to pull it up on the screen?
Yeah, Anna Grace, can you give her one?
Thank you, Rob.
I'm not seeing Rowan on the Zoom. Did I give you the wrong link? Let me check.
If you like, I can keep talking or be
There
quiet.
she is.
Okay. So the table one shows just a snapshot of the most current year that we had data available for to the prior year. And you'll see right at the bottom going to the totals, there's about 24,000 employers that are in this rated experience thing. So that's not all employers in the state of Vermont. As we talked about, some are reimbursables, meaning they're not part of the tax paying system. So of these 24,000, when you scan your eyes across all the rate classes, the first rate class 0 jumps out at you, this 15,000, almost 16,000. 2/3 of all employers are at this rate class 0, meaning they've not had an experience rating. And so they're all at that 0. If you have 0 benefits in the numerator, doesn't matter what your denominator is in terms of payroll, you're all going to be grouped the same. And that's one of the points about the system. And there's this caveat as we're talking about this. If you have the same rate experience as another employer, you will pay the same rates. There's no employer that gets cut off in any of these rate experiences where one's paying a different rate if they have the same numeric calculation. So what you do is you take that first thing. Yeah, great.
We had more employers in 24 than we did in 23.
Yes. And we've been, and I can speak to that just as like an aside, the number of business registrations that's been happening in the state of Vermont since COVID has been off the charts, like 3-4 times higher than historic levels. And we have teams of people who have to fill in these new business registrations into the system, as well as code up the form, meaning identify what industry they're in, where they're located, get contact information. And this is a big function of remote workers, right? So you have, if you are an employer, you could be the biggest employer in the world, but if you don't have an employee yet in Vermont and you have somebody who remote works from here, moves here, gets established here, that company now has to register with the state of Vermont. And so while we used to do about 300, 400 businesses in the course of a year, new business registrations, we're now at 1,200, 1,300, 1,400. And during 2021, 2022, it was even much higher than that.
Okay, so it's coming down.
It is coming down. It is coming down. We're finding some kind of stability. And what I think we'll also see, and this is something that my division works with the unemployment insurance division, is we're probably going to have to look to purge, because if someone moved here for 2 years and then they left, all of a sudden we're getting a lot of 0 filings or no filings at all. And like, how many of these accounts do you just want floating on the books? Because these could be positive economic or they can be economic indicators that can provide us signals of what's going on. And if we have an artificial number of employers, but 10% of them are running 0 employees, we might be thinking about our economy a little raw. Yeah.
I just want to check. Christine may be in the waiting room on the meeting. Do we see Christine Murphy in the waiting room? Okay, she's in there. Okay, great.
Just out of curiosity, they're paying a fee to be registered, right? So we probably would.
It does not cost anything to register. So the other piece too that Matt and I have talked about, so it's most likely the bulk of those increases are remote workers, right? So more workers in Vermont working for out-of-state companies. We are, now that we have all reimbursable employers participating in the program, we have more nonprofits that had been exempt that are now registered with the program. We've seen an increase in employer fraud. So we've seen more fraudulent businesses be created for the purpose of employing a person who then gets laid off, who then gets to collect benefits. And then the other piece is just new business growth, right? So kind of all of the above.
Yep, excellent points.
I was gonna say, you've almost answered my question, because we did change the law last year so that more businesses are required to be to pay in. Do you know what percentage or how much of the change, right, from the 22,500 to the almost 24,000 is because of that?
I don't know off the top of my head. And I think at one point we had done a rough estimate of how many nonprofits would then become eligible. I just don't remember what that
The
was.
reimbursables
Aren't
aren't
right?
part of this though, right?
Okay.
So that, what we did,
Yeah, you may not see it here. Yeah.
yeah, do you know of any reimbursable employers that have chosen that?
Some do. I mean, again, we're not talking hundreds.
Yeah.
Yeah. But in all honesty, I mean, what we saw also coming out of the pandemic is we see a lot of flip-flopping because it can be more or less advantageous to be one or the other depending on the year and what's going on, right? So we also limit how frequently you can change your status.
So looking at that base of taxable employers of 24,000, the 16,000 with the 0 experience rating, get taken right out. From there, you have your rate classes 1 to 20. And each of these rate classes is designed to be equal in size by payroll. And that's what makes it interesting, why you'll see the different number of employers is different throughout, but the payroll in theory is the exact same throughout. The only reason it might be a little different is if someone is right on the edge and they have the same experience rating as someone who got in on the, say, rate class 4, and if the cut should have been right there, but they have the same experience rating and they would have been in 5 because of the size of the payroll, they would be pushed back into rate class 4 because no two companies with the same experience rating can be in different classes. So for all intents and purposes, it's safe to assume that these buckets are all the same in size in terms of wages. And so you can actually kind of, with your eye, see where there's bigger wage buckets. Like, so the 20s, there's a lot of them. So you're going to find more smaller employers there. And those, again, kind of pointing to the fact that if they had a bad year in terms of benefits being utilized, I would push them into the highest rate class in the following year. So you can kind of see the way they're all grouped. But what makes this document kind of interesting is it starts peeling back the layers of this. So if this is just the totals, you can actually start flipping through and seeing the distribution by industry. You can start seeing the distribution not only by industry, but then whether they are negative balance. And so we can kind of look through these things. So even just at table 2 would be at the top line. The column all the way to the left is the same as the one on the first page, but now you're getting a breakdown by education. And so you can see who are the employers that are at the highest rate classes by industry. And just from my eyes, you see construction being one with 395 of their 1,500 employers being at that highest class. That jumps out as a big number. Leisure and hospitality, 100 of 700 being in the highest class, right in the middle of the table. So those are just some ones that you can see pretty clearly. And there's some graphs at the back as well that makes it a little easier to see comparisons. But maybe I'll pause there before I get to table 3 because take a big layer off the chunk now. Because once we get to table 3, now what we are focusing on is negative balance employers. How many employers are in each rate class and where they are located? And in terms of industry, as we go deeper into this, but you can see between these are in calendar years because the benefits are more on a calendar year basis, not on a tax rate schedule. You can see between the calendar year 2022 and 2023, there's a big decline in the number of negative balance employers. People coming out of the pandemic that still had benefit charges, a lot of churn was going on in the economy at that point. So just even the number of negative balance employers has declined significantly over that time period. But many of them are found in the higher rate classes. And so one of the big indications to show that there was some fluctuation in the economy, as you can see when you look at that 2022 column, how many big numbers are up here in these smaller rate classes? Like they were negative balance because their experience rating hadn't caught up. And so as they pushed forward into deeper rate classes, their contributions then were able to offset what was being paid out in benefits. So that's like just one of the ways I look at this data to see how much is in flux. And certainly 2022 was much more in flux than 2023, which was more stable. And you can see the stability and the fact that it's all zeros and ones until you get to rate class 8 with 3 people, rate class 9, 17 people, but really concentrated at those ends. So that's how the model is, one of the many ways the model is kind of self-adjusting. So it says you're utilizing the benefits heavily, we're going to move you up into the benefits, into the tax rate classes, and that will offset some of the benefits that have been paid out.
So remind me, what are the consequences of being a negative balance employer beyond you're going to get your rate increase gradually, but is the category or the concept of negative balance, does it carry any other consequences?
No, and
Just like to see.
yeah, from an employer perspective, they don't, they're not treated any different other than they're in a higher tax rate.
But you just like to see, what's going on.
Well, and it's again, as the number of negative balance employers, as it increases, and we see that some are like, again, as we see weekly benefit amounts increase, right? So we're paying more out in benefits and collecting less because our taxable wage base is low, and we're in tax schedule 1. We have the potential to have more out of sync employers in the negative balance category or close to negative balance. And so it's from the employer perspective, they're treated no differently. From our perspective, it is one of the telltale signs of trying to determine how to keep the trust fund solvent.
Mhm.
Yeah.
But there is consequence to employers. It's just not those employers, it's all employers.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that's where, because it's socialized, right? So
Right.
as this is starting to happen now, it will start kicking another schedule, could kick up the taxable wage base, which means everybody gets to pay.
Yeah. Right now, there's little direct impact because we are in the lowest tax schedule. But, Matt is famous for saying, the fund will collect what the fund needs to collect, right? And so the way that it is designed is that, as the fund decreases in size, the tax rate schedule will increase. And so smaller employers will pay more over time. And so will larger employers too. But again, as a, negative balance employer, that is more keenly felt, I think, smaller employers.
And maybe it would be helpful to the next table is table 4, which shows the same information. Again, the negative balance employers now broken out by industry, which won't surprise people. It kind of follows some of the industry table we saw before, where there's a high concentration of construction in the lowest or the highest tax rate class, and therefore many of those are actually negative balance employers. Same with that 104 for leisure and hospitality, a similar number there. Just trying to get a sense of what by industry this means. And I think that's why table 5 kind of puts dollars and cents to it, where it says in table 5, the ratio of benefits paid to contributions due for all tax paying employers. And we're seeing that, in 2023, 75% or 75 cents, that is 75 cents of every dollar paid is a benefit. So like if you're getting $1 in contributions, you're getting 75 cents out in benefits. And, during 2020, 2021, it's the inverse, right? So there was more money being paid out in benefits in terms of what was coming in contributions. And so they're just one of the other ways that we're looking at how the fund is performing and trying to track its overall health to better understand and anticipate, the fund's needs going forward, or even how to better communicate to the employer community about potential changes. One of the big things about businesses appreciate is communication and consistency, right? So no one likes surprises.
So the taxable wage base changes July 1, but the schedules that we're looking at are July 1st.
Yes. Yep. Yep. And in that 2023 data where it's, this is a great example of all data, right? So if I present
Taxable wage base is January.
Yes, so taxable wage rates.
Yeah.
January.
Yep.
Yeah.
Could I not
I
say?
thought you said July, but I mean,
No, July for the schedule.
yes.
January for the wage pay.
Yeah. So, yeah.
Oh, I'm just out of curiosity, the categories, professional and business services, what is in all of that?
Ooh, that is a real grab bag of what's called NAICS 541, the North American Industrial Classification System. We code businesses based on their primary activity in terms of how they generate revenue. If you're a construction firm, if you are a manufacturer, if you're a retail, business and professional and business and technical services. Think about it in terms of a lot of business to business services. So this could be website design. This could be accounting services. This could be economic services. It could be landscaping. It could even be temporary help agencies. Just looking to see how this one's grouped. It could be headquarters. It could be management of companies. A lot of the newest, a lot of our emerging occupations, a lot of our emerging industries are found in here. So it's that I talk about as like specialization 2.0, where Henry Ford revolutionized manufacturing with specialization 1.0. This is specialization 2.0. If I wanted to, this is just an example, Commissioner. If I ever wanted to leave the department and start my own economic consulting firm,
What?
right? I don't want to have to hire a lawyer. I don't want to have to hire HR. I don't want to have to hire payroll. I don't want to have to hire web design. I don't want to have to hire a lot of people. What I want to do is focus on economics, and I want to hire companies that do all those things. And we would all be business to business services. And this is how a lot of, the modern economy is really evolving.
Have you thought about it before?
No, of course not.
Never. So I remember reading this chart correctly that they are falling under some of the highest.
Yes.
Okay.
Yep. I don't think I'm speaking out of school. Some of this could be temporary help agencies. Some of it can be accountants. They have a very seasonal pattern and they are very good at filing paperwork. And so you could imagine that after tax season, they lay themselves off. And then at which point would be able to be eligible for benefits.
Okay. And then my last question is, like, have you noticed that this is this is an increasing growth area in the business community in general?
Yes.
Okay.
Because of the activity performed, and particularly when you're talking about remote workers, say you work for a major manufacturer, but your job is maintaining websites. We are going to classify you to the activity performed in Vermont, not to the employer's primary activity. So even if your employer makes widgets, it's what your activity here in Vermont is. And so a lot of those people are doing consulting, they're doing project management, a lot of IT work and administration. And so that's what I was going to say is, like, with any data, I'm sure this committee is well aware, I could provide a lot of information about what the quote unquote average Vermonter's wage is or the unemployment rate for Vermonters, but each individual experience is different. And so averages sometimes are not always helpful. So when you look at that 0.75 for all taxpayers.
You're on table 5, right?
Yeah, table 5, sorry. That 75 cents to the discussion here where professional business services is 97 cents, you're starting to get closer to parity. There's only one industry that's above $1, meaning more benefits are getting paid out in contributions, being construction at $1.55 per dollar of contributions, $1.55, and benefits is being paid out. So that was kind of a walkthrough of this particular table, just because it A, presents the array, and B, talks about negative balance employers, a concept that came up in our previous discussion. And one of, I think, the interesting things that we're talking and monitoring as a department is in a situation where we're getting a lot of remote workers, that 1-off, 2-off people filing in the state of Vermont as employees, and their employers are filing. What happens in an economic downturn, or what happens in a change in corporate policy if remote work is not available, or these are industries that are going to be under increased economic pressure because they're only paying for one person, and because that person probably is, if they're a remote worker, a high income earner, if they are laid off, that would expose the trust fund itself to a little bit of upside risk. or no, I guess we'll call that downside risk. In terms of contributions been paid for these newly established companies for a year, 2 years, 3 years, but then all of a sudden, if they're laid off and have difficulty because of an economic downturn, reestablishing themselves in a new position, this is something that we're kind of monitoring as a new trend. It's great that they're being registered. It's great that this is contribution coming in the door, but what does the other side of this look like? It's a lot of information, a lot of interesting levers and a lot of vocabulary.
Matt, could you, I wonder if it would be helpful for the committee to share a little bit about the Great Recession.
Sure.
And kind of where we were, what happened during the recession and what came out of the recession. Again, as we're talking about whatever the future holds economically here in today's world, kind of how did things unfold? Our best indicator is looking back to 2007, 8, 9, and what happened during that period, and then trying to look at it in today's dollars and cents to see what might occur, should there be an economic downturn, over the next 1, 2, 3, 4 years.
So I think Rowan is pulling up our 20-year statistical table again. I just turned to table 5, if possible. Table 5 kind of shows a good picture of what we were looking at in terms of our trust fund balance. This is something we were talking about with the chair earlier in this conversation. 2004, we're at $222 million to level set. 2001 was a recession. It was the dot-com explosion or bubble, whatever you want to call it. That was not a big recession in Vermont. It was a big recession across the US. Vermont, we were not overly exposed to that dot-com boom and bust that happened in the early 2000s. So 2004, the US was back in a period of economic growth, and we had nearly $3 million in the trust fund. 2025, another year period of economic growth and expansion, trust funds going down. And my predecessor, from my understandings of the historical ledger, was coming into this committee and starting discussions in 2005, as early as then, saying, hey, it's a good year and we're going down. 2006 comes along. Now we're at 180 million. This is supposed to be good economic times. The trust fund is shrinking. We talked about in table 1 how the taxable wage base was held the same, but benefits were rising because they had been indexed to keep up with costs. So as you see in 2007, though we're sitting with $162 million in the bank, that's December 2007 is when that recession occurred, the financial collapse, some people call it the Great Recession. This was a massive economic downturn, the largest recession for the US. Interestingly enough, for those who remember it, in Vermont, it was very bad. Yes, it was equally as bad almost as the 1990 recession. That was a construction-based, real estate-based recession that was predominantly concentrated in New England states, but it was a big enough economic downturn in New England states to pull the country into full recession. So unlike that 2000 recession where Vermont was not so exposed, that 1990 recession was real bad, and it was very comparable to that 2007. What made the 2007 different, they were equally deep, meaning how many jobs were lost, but the duration, how long it took to gain the jobs back was so much longer in 2007. So it was not only the depth, but the number of months to gain those jobs back. That's what made the 2007 recession so anomalous and so hard, particularly for individuals, but as well as the trust fund. As you can see, by 2008, we were starting to pay out more money, now down $40 million. And then by 2009, the heart of the Great Recession, 2009, 10, 11, you can see $120 million went away overnight, in the span of a year. And then soon after, we were borrowing money. And what's not reflected, once you start seeing those negative numbers, you need to look not only at that column 1, but column 2. Because this column 2 becomes very significant. That's the amount of money we're borrowing from the federal government. This is the amount of money we're paying interest on as a state, not from anywhere else other than the Vermont General Fund. And I think the chair has pointed it out. This is one of the risks associated with keeping a small trust fund balance, is that if you have to borrow that money, the federal government says, yeah, we'll loan it to you, but you have to pay for it back or you have to pay the interest from somewhere else. And so you have to find a source of money. And at that time, we used the general fund to pay interest. And during economic downturns, like you can imagine, people aren't looking, that the line for people asking for funds from the general fund gets long. And so you're just another person in that line. So yeah, at one point we were borrowing $77.7 million. So typically we were paying, and it's in here, so I don't even need to guess it, but the benefits, we were doing, 40, 50, $60 million a year in benefits. In 2010, we did 200 million. In 2011, we did 150 million. So in 2 years, we did $350 million of benefits. And those are big numbers, well bigger than what the trust fund was coming in. And the only thing just to keep in mind as you're swallowing that $350 million number, which is in 2010, 2011 dollars, is we are getting contributions at the same time. So the contributions, the fund says, fund's going down. Even in 2006 and 2007, the fund's saying, we're going down. We're going to start moving up the schedules. We're going to, start increasing the tax rate. So actually that mechanism had already started. So the tax rate schedules, we started moving out, and we were at tax rate schedule 5 for a number of years until the Health Trust Fund returned. But to give you an order of magnitude, we're talking about like a lot of times double or triple the tax rates that an employer is typically used to paying. It's either going to be double or triple depending on how much the fund says we need to recover.
So, the current fund ratio, what does that compare? Fund against what?
The current fund ratio, it is the current fund ratio is basically a calculation of what your benefits going out versus your fund has in it. So it's a ratio of possible obligations versus money on reserve to pay. Yeah.
Okay.
And so what determines the tax rate schedule is called the high benefit cost ratio, where you find the highest rate in the past 10 years. And currently we exclude 2020 from that calculation. Otherwise, that would be BOSS for many, many years. That 20 or what is the highest ratio in the last 10 years. And we're going to use that based on what your current fund balance is to set the tax rate schedule. So what was interesting is from a high benefit cost ratio, 2011 coming out of that 2007 recession was actually higher than 2021 because of the value of dollars. But now that 2011 is no longer in the picture because the 10 years is moving on, 2021 will be the BOSS year until we hit the next economic downturn. Or 10 years passes. Let's hope that's the truth.
So I'm looking at that 500 million down to 238. That's so it's a good thing we had the 500 versus being higher up there.
Yeah.
That number, it would have really been a problem. Is that 500 million the kind of goal that we should have?
That's a lot of times considered a public policy question, and I try and stay out of public policy discussions.
Matt doesn't get into conjecture very much. But
Well, I mean, and I'm not saying this would, it's a 100 year issue that
Right.
happened. But you never know.
Yep.
And if that's probably the worst case scenario, and thankfully we were okay.
Yeah.
I won't call it a debate. It's a conversation this committee and other committees have had, even pre-pandemic, is how much do you want to have to call yourself healthy, right? And I think prior to the pandemic, we were all I think for the most part agreeing that, 500 plus million is on the high side for a small state like us. When you look comparatively, but at the same time, and we didn't obviously use all those 500 million for a variety of different reasons, but also how often, what is there's a likelihood that another recession will come, multiple times over the next, 300 years, right? But, how often are you going to see a global health pandemic over the next 100 years? And so we're probably need to be somewhere in the middle between like trying to manage for the next recession versus something that's slightly greater. When we look at the last recession, and if we think about it, and I said this in another committee, someone asked me just off the cuff, what would you be comfortable with? And my comment was somewhere over 400, right? Had you asked me pre-pandemic, I would have said somewhere over 350, right? But we're probably now into the mid 400s when you're looking at what would be considered healthy and able to sustain the next recession because of benefit dollars, right? So we haven't talked a lot about this, but Matt often presents and may have presented in this committee, the pandemic was very deep, but very fast, right? And didn't last very long. And what you see with recessions is more of a slow burn. So they're not as deep in terms of the number of affected people, but they last for an exceptionally long time compared to the pandemic, right? So you have to be able to withstand, what would be a multi-year event, probably more like a 4 or 5 year event versus what ended up being like a 1 year event or 18-month event. So again, not to put hard numbers around it. The other piece too is it's a trust fund solvency is or healthiness is sometimes more an art than a science. So there are states out there that focus more on lower taxes to employers, but with the understanding that they will borrow more frequently. And so there are other states out there that ride that line and fully plan to borrow on a more regular basis. Vermont took a more conservative approach in that it didn't want to find itself in a borrowing circumstance again, and therefore created a system that replenished the trust fund to a level that allowed us to make it through the pandemic without borrowing any money. And we were one of the few. Right. But again, for a state our size with the number of employees and the number of employers, $500 million at the time we were the most solvent fund in the country at the time. Right. So again, there's, sometimes it's a little more of an art than a science. But I think when we look, if I were to, again, look to the future, we definitely need to be over 400 million and probably more towards the middle of that to be able to not only get in, withstand the next recession from beginning to end without getting into a significant borrowing circumstance.
Remember that the way this is set up, it's self-regulating. So, in 2019, when we had 500 and almost 511 million, that I think had it not been for COVID, that you would have started to see schedules start to drop, taxable wage base start to drop, so that would come down some. Mm-hmm. And we really don't know yet where that self-regulating feature is.
Yeah.
But I think you're right. I think we want to be somewhere over the 400 mark.
Well, and it's hard to be it would be much easier to be self-regulating in COMCs, consistency, right? It's a lot harder to do that when you have things like pandemics, and we can talk about the next recession, but who actually knows how deep it's going to be, how long it's going to last, right? Like that's an unknown. The control or the part where you all become instrumental is having that mindset of having a healthy trust fund, not ensuring that Vermont either doesn't get into a borrowing situation or a limited borrowing situation, but the most control that we all have over this is probably more on the taxable wage base. It's a lot easier, and I said this in the beginning, and it probably means more now having gone through all this, but as Matt talked about in in the years following the recession, that, you know, the legislature stepped in and artificially set the taxable wage base for a number of years, and then allowed the calculation to kick in. And that can be used either way, right? Like the legislature could say the next time we're at, you know, $500 million, right? Like we want to move the taxable wage base to $5,000, right? Or whatever the recommendation is at the time to minimize the impact on business because of how healthy the trust fund is. Conversely, talking about like, what do we actually need the taxable wage base to be to collect more money so we can be prepared for the next situation.
You gotta be careful you don't lower it too low.
Right.
Because it takes time
Yeah.
for things to catch up.
Yeah, it's kind of like turning the water on the faucet, right? Like it's not immediate and it takes a minute for it to regulate.
A statement and a question. My statement is, I think about this more like I think about how do I save for my household? How many months of income do I want to have in the bank rather than a number based on what my expenses are? And I look at this and our expenses keep going up because the amount of wages we're paying out, the wages keep going up, right? So a number as a goal for me it feels too elusive, right? So I want us to be thinking about that too, because as our wages go up, and let's hope. Anyway, so my question is, looking at the balance, December 31, that first column, it looks like the increases were much bigger in like 2015, 16 year on year than they were in, 22 to 23, right? That's a much smaller increase. And is that because of the rates that we were charging? Is that because we're still working to get out of that recession? Because that to me is, the 20 million, I know it's a lot of money, but it's a much smaller increase year on year than they were in the late teens, 20 teens.
Sorry, which table you're on?
So yeah, but looking at like
The delta.
leading up to the pandemic, we were gaining money in the fund at a faster rate than
A lot to do with what we did. And coming up with what we call it grand bargain.
Yeah.
At the time, where we froze maximum weekly benefits, we reinstituted a 1 week waiting period. So there were a number of things that we did on the employee side and a lot of things that we did on the employer side, that those things, once we get to a certain point, then the maximum weekly benefits started to index up again.
So we were specifically trying to increase that.
Yes.
Yeah, so what isn't readily apparent here, but one is you had more money in the fund, so you were gaining more interest leading up to that 510 million. But then what we're also seeing now is the reason we're seeing a slowing of money into the fund is because the amount of benefits, so not the number of people, but the amount we're paying to each individual has increased, right? So there is more benefits being paid out than what's being collected. And also that our taxable wage base is now lower than it has been since like pre-recession, right? So
So all that.
yeah, so we're at 13, well, in 2023, we're at 13.5, we're at 14.8 now, but when you look at that amount, it was back in 2011, we were at 13,000, right? So again, it's starting to creep back up, but we were at a low.
Table one. Something one. This column.
Thank you.
So yeah, currently at 14.8. So it's missing 2 years of data on this because of the way this table gets produced. But you can see how some of that, we had higher taxable wage bases.
So if you're looking at
during
larger
winter.
gains here, right, our taxable wage base during that period was 16.4, 16.8, 17.3, 17.6. We're now down to 13.5 and now 14.8.
again, at the same time, we froze, we weren't indexing up.
Right. Didn't you freeze benefit amounts too?
Yeah. And so there's a lot of things that we did that really drove it up quickly. And now we're in a place now, I think, where we're not doing any of those things. And I don't know, I think you'll be coming out with the schedules, because they're gonna, so we'll know soon if there's gonna be a schedule change, which will then increase the amount of money coming into the fund as well, if we go from schedule 1 to 2 or schedule 1 to 3. I don't know what the calculation is gonna look like, but we'll know that soon. So that's how that's how things adjust. Sometimes they take a little bit of time.
Yeah.
But all of this, all of that quick rise drove rates down. And now that we're indexing back up again, doing all the things that we're hoping now that start seeing some things kind of level out of where they should be and how they should be working correctly. But it was not an easy process to get us into a good place. It took 2 years of a lot of work between work that we did with Ways and Means and on the Senate side as well, working with the administration and working with labor as well and the business community. We made a lot of decisions that nobody was happy about. But in the end, I think it proved itself out with us going, having COVID and being able to survive it without any problems. So you're all here, we're the gatekeepers of Huntsville. Making sure it's healthy, that we're protecting employees and not overextending employers. Yeah, so remember that.
It is a balance, for sure. I know I'm just tracking time. We've got about 5 minutes left, so I don't know if there's any particular item of UI you'd like us to cover or any other questions or thoughts you have, but I can pause here and see how you want to spend the last couple of minutes.
Any other questions?
Yeah, so as you're thinking about the way the system is set up right now, do you have any red flags that we need to actually be thinking about in this legislature?
During this session?
I mean,
No.
like this 2-year session.
Oh, well, the data is always coming in, right? But I think that one of the points that was made during the last time I was here was that the year-over-year growth in the unemployment insurance trust fund looks good until you break down the components of why it's growing. So if we're showing a $30 million increase in our unemployment insurance trust fund year over year, 15 million of that was one-time money that was owed to us from the pandemic and federal benefit program. So, $15 million that is interest is level, the trust fund staying as high as it is. So actually, when you look at how much more in contributions are we taking in terms of benefits, we're talking about a $5 million difference. And this is the smallest it's been in a very long time. I would harken a guess back to a long time,
Just
like at least a decade plus, right? Where, contributions have consistently outpaced benefits such that the trust fund has been growing and gotten us to the point where we are now. But when we're looking at this, they are starting to converge. Maybe that's a temporary thing, and we'll know more as the contributions are tallied for this first quarter activity. As the commissioner said, this is the busiest time of the year. So first quarter is due at the end of April. Last year, we collected $67 million in contributions. 40 million of that 67 was collected during these 2 months of April, May, June. Like 37 of that 67 was collected in April. So we're still counting pennies from a busy April where we get this big flush or big insurgence of cash into the fund. That's going to be another indication of how it's going. Because one of the things, there's been more stability across the job market, which a lot of times people think is good things, especially for employers, turnover ratios, things like that. But for the trust fund, when people aren't changing jobs, they're just paying the taxable wage base and then they're being capped out for contributions. When you had 2 jobs in a year, it's possible you're getting contributions for that 2 people. And so we've seen stability across the labor market right now in 2021, 2022. There's a lot of job changing going on. And now we're seeing kind of like the contributions kind of calming a little to like more of like a baseline level, based on more of a stable economic condition.
In terms of red flags, I think Matt hit it, which is we're probably at that point now where we need to be having this conversation, right? The biggest for me, the biggest red flags are what Matt just mentioned, right? So how the fund, what does it look like in terms of dollars coming in and dollars going out, and the difference there. But also, I think just the other one is what we're seeing nationally. It's not specific to anything I'm seeing in our program. It's just the uncertainty, whether we're talking tariffs or otherwise, that just creates a very unstable world. And then I think, they're probably what's best for us in working with this committee, over the next 12 or 18 months is really talking, unfortunately, maybe we do our best work in chaotic and stress-filled environments, but you'd love to think, okay, now let's start having this conversation and talking about all the different levers and then being as thoughtful as possible on which lever to pull when. For instance, right, we could be talking about taxable wage base, or we could be talking about the fact that we've got these riders on the maximum weekly benefit amount, right? And we could be talking about what to do with those riders, whether it's, pausing them or something like that. Again, there's things we can be doing to either slow the money flowing out of the fund or increase the money flowing into the fund. And wanting to be, our job is to be thinking down the road and around the corner, right? Like we've got to be thinking a couple steps ahead.
But the sort of levers that you're talking about that you could use, you're talking about extraordinary levers beyond the sort of self-adjustment stuff, right?
Yeah.
And the difficulty there is can't predict the future, can you?
Well, and unfortunately, I mean, and we see this in government period all the time, right? Is the toughest decisions get made, but sometimes they're often too late because we have to wait for the fire to act, to actually be at the front door. And we saw that during the pandemic, or, pick a topic, whatever. But it's hard in our worlds to be thinking, 3 years in advance or 2 years in advance.
I think, Matt, when you're looking at, so right now you're kind of looking at whether or not we adjust schedules. And you're taking into account $15 million that came in, the 10 million that come. If you were to exit those, then what would that look like? And, are you required to look at those pieces? Or should you just be looking at, here's the schedules, here's where the fund is, absent the interest in the one-time Fed payment, and then adjust schedules according to that?
Yeah, as currently written in statute, it's pretty specific about the balance available to pay benefits. And because the interest gets awarded to us in the fund as available to pay benefits, those things do get included. But as thought exercises, we certainly could do that. As I said, we probably know the worst year on record is going to be 2021. And now it's just a question of finalizing how 2024 ended. In terms of wages, because that's where that's what we're waiting on. We have 3 of the 4 numbers to do the calculation. It's just tabulating that last number to level set. How big was the economy at this time when we had this much in the fund?
But the 15 million that we're talking, that we got back from we paid that out,
Yes.
right? So that came out of the fund.
Right.
So had we not had to pay that out,
Mm-hmm.
and
It would have been
available there. So I think it's kind of a wash.
Yep.
But 10 million that we're getting in interest, I think we ought to think about how do we count that or should we count that? As we're looking to adjust things and I guess we'll find out shortly where, what the schedule, what the schedule will be. And maybe when we come back in January, we can talk about that. And Matt's gonna run scenarios of where he thinks we might be by the end of the year by adjusting that and then if there's levers we want to pull, Matt can make those calculations and come back to the committee.
And I guess that was my question, right? Is do you have the levers or do you need new levers? Right. So that's really what because if you have the levers, if our predecessors have already set up the system in a way that you can do that work, then that'd be fantastic.
I think the levers will be, there are not extraordinary levers that we can pull without your help, right? So when we find ourselves in these situations, it'll be a combination of, the department in line with the administration saying, we need to do X in order to prevent Y, right? And then we will need action from the legislature. Because there is very little that I or Matt have authority to do that we aren't already doing, which is just the math, right? It's all calculation based now. So anything outside of that calculation requires legislative change.
The rate schedule, so that's a legislative.
No, but the rate schedule, we don't get to pick Matt can't say, just based on what the economy looks like, I'm going to move us to schedule 4, right? So there is a calculation that he performs that determines whether we stay in 1 or we move to 2 or 3 or 4 or 5.
Based on the formula.
Yeah.
Think about it like it's curling, like the legislative process sets the rock in motion. And then we're going to see where it goes. And then we might need more legislative intervention to kind of tweak it or turn it. And so as an order of magnitude, when we've had these deeper conversations at the time, and I would want to polish these numbers, but for every $1,000 in taxable wage base is about $6 million to the fund. Every schedule is worth about $18 million to the fund. So we're currently at Schedule 1. And, if we the fund will start saying, I need more money, and we can anticipate about if it moved up a schedule being about $18 million, but it's on a state fiscal year. So you kind of see it in pieces. And so it takes a while to react.
And the other piece, that's an important piece to point out because there is no fast way to get a lot of money into the fund, right? So that's why, again, we're having this conversation now because there is not a lever to flip that drops $100 million into the fund.
It's like we're going to add 5. Yeah, it's like the curling. It's like slight adjustments, but otherwise the rock is rolling.
Yeah.
Even if the schedule goes up in July,
right,
we'll see a little bump. We won't see the big bump until a year from now.
April, right? Yeah. So if we change the schedule in July, we will see a big cash flow increase in April of the following year.
Yeah.
See a little bit, but not
Yeah.
anywhere near what we wrote next year.
Right.
Commissioner, thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Happy to come back when you need us.
Yes.
I think it's a good information for the committee and. Thank you.
Just as an aside, we didn't talk about this and it's not necessarily relevant to the economy, but there are creative things that other states do that this committee will eventually talk about. I think down the road, if I'm putting my kind of site foreshadowing hat on is, states are looking at creative ways to fund the administration of programs. So, without increasing the burden on employers, can you take a portion of what they're contributing in some other type of form or method so that it doesn't end up in the federal treasury? So some states, they add a surcharge, but then, so if there's a surcharge of $100, I'm just using easy math, right? If there's a surcharge of $100 for an employer, they also may simultaneously reduce their contributions by $100. So it's still a net neutral for the employer, but more money. Again, now is not the time, but when you're looking at $500 million in the fund and sunny skies ahead, right? That's when you start talking about creative ways to fund the administration of the program. The continuation, we don't want to get into another situation of a 50-year-old technology system, right? So we're going to have to talk future about how do we upgrade that technology on a scheduled basis, yada, yada, yada. So.
Scary part is that when we start pulling that money away from the trust fund,
Yeah.
it becomes far,
Yeah.
for
Yeah.
other legislators.
Yes.
Wanting to utilize those funds for other things.
Just again, food for thought. Now is not the time, but thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. So committee, let's do a short break, be back at
I need it.
15. We'll continue our discussions on 137. We'll notice tomorrow, so it'll be up for action on Thursday. We'll see how far we can get today.